The mess hall of the Concordia stretched across 3 decks, its curved walls lined with observation ports that offered glimpses of the swirling nebula beyond. Zarath pressed her 6-fingered hands against the cool metal of her tray, watching. The pale blue nutrient paste congeal as she searched for an empty table. Every seat seemed occupied except for the ones beside her usual spot in the corner. The Velcran refugees from the outer colonies had learned to give her space, not out of malice, but from the bone-deep fear that radiated from her presence like heat from a dying star. She was the only survivor of Kepler Station. The memory clawed at her consciousness, the screech of tearing metal, the whisper of atmosphere bleeding into space, the silence that followed the Devourer's feeding frenzy. 2,000 souls had called that research station home. Now only she remained, marked by horrors that made even her own people uncomfortable. Zarath settled at her isolated table, mechanically spooning the paste into her mouth while the conversations of others washed over her like distant static. The Thorian merchants discussed trade routes. The Centauri diplomats debated territorial boundaries. The hegemony officers planned patrol schedules. All of them carefully avoided looking in her direction. "Mind if I sit?" The voice was unfamiliar, rough, with the strange vocal inflections that marked it as human. Zarath looked up to find a tall figure in a pilot's jacket, holding a steaming cup of what the humans called coffee. His hair was dark with streaks, of premature gray, and his eyes held the same haunted quality she recognized in her own reflection. She gestured to the empty chairs around her table without speaking. The human, she noticed the name Chen stitched on his jacket, took the seat directly across from her, not beside her, where he might seem to be seeking comfort, but facing her like an equal. He didn't try to make conversation. He simply sat, sipping his coffee and occasionally glancing at the tactical displays that cycled through the wall screens. His presence was different from the others, not pitying, not fearful, just quietly present. Days passed. Chen continued to sit at her table, bringing his meals and his silence. Sometimes he'd nod when she caught his eye. Once, he slid a small chocolate bar across the table when she'd been struggling with particularly vivid flashbacks. But he never asked questions, never offered empty platitudes about survival and moving forward. Other passengers began to notice. Zarath caught whispered conversations about the strange human who sits with the broken Velcran. The comments stung, but Chen's unwavering routine provided an anchor in the storm of her thoughts. It was during the 3rd week that the ship's alarms began to wail. "All passengers to emergency stations," Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the comm system. Devourer scout ships detected at the edge of sensor range. The mess hall erupted into chaos. Passengers scrambled for the evacuation pods, their faces masks of terror. Zarath remained frozen in her seat, the familiar paralysis of traumatic memory locking her muscles in place. She could hear them again. The hunting calls of the Devourers, the wet sounds of their feeding, the desperate screams that had echoed through Kepler Station's corridors. A warm hand touched her shoulder. Chen had moved to the seat beside her, his presence grounding her in the present moment. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the panic around them. "You're not there anymore. You're here, on the Concordia, and those bastards haven't won yet." She looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected: understanding. Not the clinical comprehension of a counselor or the distant sympathy of a stranger, but the raw recognition of someone who had walked through his own fires. "Mars Colony 7, he said simply. "Lost my wife and daughter when the Devourers hit the outer settlements. Been flying patrol runs for 3 years, hunting the scouts that got away." The ship shuddered as defensive systems came online. Through the observation ports, Zarath could see the sleek organic curves of Devourer vessels emerging from the nebula's embrace. They moved like predators, their bioluminescent markings pulsing with alien hunger. "The evacuation pods won't make it," she whispered, her first words to him in weeks of shared silence. The Devourers track heat signatures. They'll pick them off one by one. Chen nodded grimly. That's what I figured, which is why I'm not running. He stood and extended his hand to her. My ship's in Bay 7. She's fast and she's armed. But I could use a navigator who knows their hunting patterns. Zareth stared at his outstretched hand. For weeks, people had tried to help her with words, with professional therapy, with careful distances that acknowledged her trauma while keeping them safely removed from it. Chen was offering something different. Not salvation, but partnership. Not healing, but purpose. She took his hand. They ran through corridors filled with panicking passengers, past security officers trying to maintain order, toward the docking bays where Chen's modified courier ship waited. The Phoenix was smaller than she'd expected, but she could see the weapon pods grafted onto its hull and the enhanced engines that spoke of a pilot serious about his hunt. Strap in, Chen said, sliding into the pilot's seat, and tell me where they don't expect us to go. As the ship lifted off, Zareth felt something she hadn't experienced since Kepler Station. Purpose. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, carrying her trauma like a burden too heavy to share. She was a weapon, forged in the fires of loss and tempered by the quiet understanding of someone who had refused to let her face those fires alone. The Phoenix screamed toward the Devourer scout ships, carrying two broken souls who had found wholeness not in healing, but in the choice to fight back together. Behind them, the evacuation pods scattered like frightened prey. Ahead, the enemy waited, and for the first time in months, Zareth smiled.